been a while since I've been on here. It's been crazy and hectic for me, like it has been for a lot of folks. In fact, like a lot of folks, I found myself sitting in front of my computer a lot and participating in lots of Zoom meetings. And that's not complaining at all. I'm actually pretty thankful for that technology. I mean, without that technology, the technology of Zoom or FaceTiming or GoToMeeting or whatever it is, uh, we wouldn't have been able to really stay connected with a lot of people, our family, our friends, churches, even a lot of folks doing work on Zoom. So I'm really thankful for that. In fact, just a few nights ago, I was able to meet with folks from my church in Kingsport, Bethel Presbyterian Church, and even some folks from Windsor Avenue Pres and Bristol. And we were able to have a conversation about what's the new normal for face-to-face worship. In fact, both Bethel and Windsor will start, uh, Lord willing, on June 14th. And so we were putting together our plan for the 14th and Sundays beyond that. I mean, what's that going to look like? There's this new normal. What is it for in-person worship and all that? So as we talked through all these details about our June 14th service, face-to-face service, which, by the way, we'll still put on Zoom, put on Facebook Live and YouTube so that folks can continue who don't feel comfortable yet come into church, can still participate in worship, which, that's one of the good things that's coming out of this pandemic or whatever it is we're going through, is that we're utilizing technology in ways that maybe we had been slow to incorporate in the past or didn't really see a need for. But now we're gonna continue to Zoom. We're gonna continue to bring those things into our worship. But as we talked about some of the plans, one of my friends from Bethel, who actually has posted a number of videos here on YouTube and on Bethel's Facebook page, Gary, he brought up this old principle. It's the KISS principle. No, not Gene Simmons and the band, but the KISS principle. It stands for keep it simple. Actually, some people say keep it simple, stupid, but my mom always said no name calling, so we'll just go with keep it simple. And that phrase itself, from what I understand, was coined a long time ago by someone in the U.S. Navy who was responsible or worked with an engineering or defense department or folks in terms of designing systems, designing processes and equipment and all that was to be utilized during combat. And so the idea was, don't design an overly complicated system or piece of equipment that's going to be utilized in combat, because when all hell breaks loose, when the bombs are dropping and the bullets are whizzing by, the last thing you need is for this really overly complicated system to exist, because that can literally cost people their lives. I mean, especially if you think about that someone is going to be operating that equipment or running the system, and maybe they haven't totally been trained on it fully yet, but they're sort of stepping into the breach. And you need systems and processes that are simple enough to operate during the most chaotic times. And so the KISS principle was born: keep it simple, stupid. So you want to avoid overly complicating things. Just keep it simple. And I need to get something out of the way. If you've ever spent any time around pastor types, guys and gals like me, folks that are especially Presbyterians, I say that because I'm Presbyterian, we can overly complicate things. We can add more things than we need to. Maybe that's because we've spent a lot of time studying theology or church polity or whatever. But, sometimes we can make things overly complicated when they don't really need to be that complicated. And then those things that, complicated designs or systems, they usually, in chaotic times, they get tossed, right? They're not effective or useful. And in essence, they're probably not effective or useful in the mundane, in the ordinary times either. So years ago, I actually was, I interviewed a couple of well-known pastors. They're both really good men, and I'm not trying to disparage either one of them in either way at all. I really appreciated the time that they gave me during the interview. And I asked them some of the same sort of questions about, what will it look like to pastor in the 21st century? What does it look like to help people to grow in their faith in the 21st century? What does it look like? What do they think it's going to look like to help people grow in terms of knowing Jesus better, and in terms of what it means to lead the church? What does that look like? And so, I kind of expected the same answers from both of those pastors. What I didn't expect was this stark difference that I got when I talked to them. I mean, one pastor answered every question with, "Now, Mark, it comes down to three things." Or, "Now, Mark, if you follow these 5 principles, you'll be successful." Now, to be honest with you, I greedily wrote those things down. I mean, he's a pastor of a large church. He's clearly successful, and it sounded good. I mean, I, like a lot of people, want someone else to sort of lay out for me the step-by-step action plan, so I can just, hey, if you do this, you'll be guaranteed. And back in that part of my life, that early sort of pastor sort of training kind of time in my life, man, I just sort of ate that up. My heart of hearts, I think I knew, really, everything boils down to 3 steps or 5 steps. If I just do these things, then I'll be successful. Like this idea of the law of linearity. If I do A, then I'm guaranteed to get B. I think a lot of people sort of fall into that. I mean, I think at that time I certainly did. In fact, the pastor seemed to be offering this blueprint for success, and it was something he really believed in. And in fact, it was something that he really thought was the success way to do things, because he had actually written it up and put it in a book. And then later on, as I listened to his sermons, that's exactly how his sermons were laid out. So a lot of people sat there and weekly took notes about, the step-by-step instructions. So I left there that day feeling like I had a real jump on things, and with a signed copy of his book, and it just sounded great. Sounded like the right sort of thing. Until a few days later, when I sat down with the second pastor. I sat down with him and expected the same sort of answers. But right from the beginning, the second pastor made something very clear. He had one foundational principle that stood at the backbone, at the foundation for everything he did as a pastor and as a Christian man, as a human being, as a man himself, as a husband, a father, all that kind of thing. He had one fundamental principle. He said the whole of the Christian life comes down to staying anchored to the center, and Jesus is the center. If something doesn't lead a person, including himself, he said, if something doesn't lead a person to a deeper understanding of who Jesus is and who Jesus wants us to be, then it isn't worth doing. And so sort of leave it to the side. With that in mind, he said, the job of the pastor then is always to point yourself and to the people you're called to shepherd and the people you encounter towards Jesus, always. If that isn't the KISS principle, keep it simple, applied to the Christian life and the Christian faith, if that isn't the KISS principle, I don't know what is. The whole of the Christian life should be anchored to the center, and Jesus is the center. If something doesn't lead a person, doesn't lead me into a deeper understanding of who Jesus is, and into a deeper understanding of who he wants me to be, then it isn't worth doing. And given the sort of chaotic world that we're living in at the moment, at varying levels of chaos, that might be a great principle to put into effect. This idea that Jesus is the center. I might really, at the risk of overly, reducing things down to overly simplify it, it might be a great principle for us to incorporate into our lives, right? That Jesus is the center. I want to be anchored to the center, and that if something is not helping me to understand Jesus better or more deeply, and understanding who he is and who he wants me to be, then it's not really worth doing. That's a pretty simple way of kind of bringing it down, right? At the risk, though, of overly complicating things, as Presbyterian ministers like me are prone to do, I, I started thinking about that. Well, okay, that sounds great and all, but what does that mean? How do I do that? And it might be helpful to borrow something from someone from the 14th, 15th century, someone I mentioned before in a previous devotional. It's from The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And I'm going to read it out of the book. Actually, it's this book. It was my mom's. It's really cool. It was actually given to her. We'll see that. My mom, Edna, from John Thrasher, March 1982. He's really great pastor and friend of our family. But he gave her this book, and this is the very first page, right? This is what he says. He said, "Let therefore our chiefest endeavor be to meditate upon the life of Christ. Whosoever will fully and with relish understand the words of Christ must endeavor to conform his life wholly to the life of Christ. Let our chief endeavor be to meditate upon the life of Christ. Whosoever will fully and with relish understand the words of Christ must endeavor to conform their life wholly to the life of Christ." In order to stay anchored to the center, in order to have a deeper understanding of who Jesus is and what sort of person he wants us to be, we probably ought to spend a lot of time meditating on the life of Jesus. By meditate, I think Kempis meant that we ought to spend time mulling it over, thinking about it, contemplating it, reflecting on it, talking to people about the life of Jesus. I mean, sometimes we think about meditating, people think about, emptying their mind, but I think that the Christian notion of meditating means to sort of fill it with the things of God. And so what better life to meditate on than the life of Jesus? And mulling it over, contemplating, reflecting on it. And what will it do? What will that do? I think it'll anchor our lives to his life so that we don't feel disjointed by when life gets overly complicated or when it gets confusing or when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And not all of it at once, not reading all four gospels at once, but taking little segments of the passages and thinking about it during the day. Maybe start the day reading through part of the gospels and reading through the life of Jesus, and thinking about it during the day, throughout the day. I think that'll do something to our heart, mind, soul, and maybe even physically do something. I'm not trying to reduce the Christian life down to the innate or the trite, but I do think there's something to be said about the KISS principle when it comes to Christian maturity, to keep it simple, to stay anchored to Jesus. In order to do that, we have to know him. And if something isn't helping us to have a deeper understanding of who he is and who he is calling us to be, then we should probably kick it to the curb. We don't need it. Certainly, I mean, there's tons of devotional books. There's millions of books to read, but perhaps just spending enough time just reading through the gospel and reading through a particular section or just a small section and thinking about it, thinking about how Jesus interacted with people, what he had to say to people and the kinds of people he interacted with and what he did in those moments. I mean, it's not going to give you a step-by-step action plan, like do these 4 principles and you will have success. It doesn't offer that. It offers something far deeper. It anchors us to this person of Jesus and the work that he did on earth, the work that he did on the cross, and the work he's still doing in the lives of people. It's a simple act of devotion, and I think it ties a person's heart to Jesus's heart and to what he's about in the world. At least I think that's what Kempis meant, and I'm pretty sure that's what the second pastor that I talked to meant. And so I think it's a wise thing for us to do, this KISS principle, um, that we keep it simple and we meditate on the life of Jesus. I hope you're doing well, staying healthy and safe and strong. And I hope that we can gather together again in the near future, June 14th, if not sooner. If I hope that works out. But I want to remind you that God loves you, that He is at work in the world and at work in you. He makes His love known to us through His Son, which is one of the reasons why we should meditate on the life of Jesus. And He makes it known to us through His Word and through the fellowship that we can have with one another, even through Zoom. And He sends us out into the world with this blessing. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face to shine upon you, be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you His shalom. Amen.